As we move through this course, we will be talking about leadership character and all of the different dimensions of being a leader who has good character. In Chapter 1, we will do an overview of what leadership character is, and we'll put the idea of leadership character into context of why it's important to you and why it's important for the workplace. We are going to start with what is character. So character is the driving force for building competencies and demonstrating commitment. What does this mean? Well, competencies are skills, abilities, and knowledge. So these are things such as communication, critical thinking, working well in a group. Commitment is how much effort we put into using our competencies and hence strengthening them. So character is something that can be developed over time, which means that if we want to build our leadership character, we need to be committed to working on our competencies. Your leadership character is entirely in your own hands and in your own choices. Take a quick pause of the video and go and read the financial industry example on page 2 in your textbook, and then watch the clip and the PowerPoint from the movie The Big Short, and we'll reconvene back here. Hopefully you all have watched the clip now. So what I want you to think about with this clip is, what does this say about the character of the bankers? So how is the character of these people different from those people who gave the loans that inspired the crisis? So as we think about this financial crisis and we think about leadership character, we really need to be thinking about that sometimes a lot of the blame is placed on a certain group of people when something bad happens. But if we think about the leadership character of everybody who was possibly involved, what kind of character did they have, and did they all play a role? So our character is about our choices that go above and beyond ourselves. Our character is a collection of virtues and values and traits that when they're all joined together, they make up a complete person. So what are virtues, values, and traits? So virtues are thought to be universal. They represent our moral behavior, and these are things such as courage and temperance. Values, on the other hand, are deeply held beliefs. These are generally formed by our religion, our family, our education, and our personal experiences. Um, Our values tend to be consistent across culture. So all cultures, no matter where you are in the world, tend to value things such as loyalty, responsibility, and commitment. Virtues and traits can change, or virtues and values can change over time. And so we can work on growing them and strengthening them, just like when we talk about working on our competencies. We also see that virtues and values have overlapping definitions, so it won't be uncommon for you to see a word such as courage listed as both a virtue and a value, so you'll see some overlap there. Traits, on the other hand, may be inherited and tend to stay stable over time. So these are aspects of our personality. They are things that, although can be changed, are really difficult to change because, again, they're an inherent part of our personality. These are things such as introversion and extroversion. So if you are introvert, you can make efforts to be outgoing and be more talkative in certain situations, such as if you're at work or with your group of friends, but that doesn't change the core trait of being reserved or quiet. List of some of the virtues that are common, but this list is obviously not exhaustive. Aristotle had a list of 12 virtues that he considered important, but he placed special emphasis on 4 of them, which were known as the cardinal virtues. Those were prudence, which is also known as wisdom, justice, temperance, or also called moderation, and fortitude, also known as courage. But as we were talking about building our virtues, it's also important to know that there is such a thing as having too much of a virtue, just like having too little is bad, so is having too much. Having too little or too much of a virtue turns that virtue into a vice. So having courage is good, but without courage, we are cowards and we won't stand up for ourselves or others. Too much courage, on the other hand, and we may make rash decisions that could make a bad situation even worse. Here's a list of some values and traits. So again, values can change as we change and as we go through different life cycles. But traits, again, are fairly stable. They can be amplified or diminished with time, but they never really change. So we know that character can be developed and can be built through our choices and our communication. So behavior is our focus on building that character and building that moral muscle memory. So here's some food for thought. How do you define success? How do you know when you're a successful person? Who do you want to be when you grow up? And that includes what kind of values and virtues and traits do you want to exhibit to those people around you? And then how do you want to be remembered when you die? Because a lot of times our character and how we exhibit those virtues and those values and those traits is really the lasting memories that we leave with other people. So, although we get to choose how we want to be and how we display our virtues, we need to be warned about merely appearing to be virtuous. So, it's really easy for us to say virtuous things and portray traits like courage, but it's a lot harder to actually follow through with those actions. So, we need to be aware of virtue signaling, and this is actually taking a stand just to look good. So we know that in this day and age, social media makes it really easy to speak without acting. We can be for a lot of causes without ever, actually going to protest, actually supporting them either physically or monetarily or doing anything to actually help advance the cause besides posting on social media. So we need to be really careful about that because we need to be active in our virtues. So one of the examples of this is Taylor Swift was accused of virtue signaling in her song and video "You Need to Calm Down," which was a gay rights anthem, and she actually won an award for that music video. And so, of course, her acceptance speech turned political. But a lot of people said that this was just her way of making it seem like that she was supportive of gay rights without actually doing anything um, to back up what she was saying. So people see through deceit. So if you're putting on a show of being virtuous, people are going to notice that. There are many definitions of leadership, and it has been defined in many different ways over the years. Kevin Kruse is responsible for the definition of leadership that we use, and that definition is that leadership is a process of social influence which maximizes the efforts of followers towards the achievement of a goal. So within this, there are four components of leadership. The first is that leadership is a process. Leadership is not just a trait that we have, but it is an interactive event that affects our followers. These followers can be our peers, they can be those who report to us, and they can even be those who we report to. The next component is influence. So leaders affect others, and by definition, if you are a leader, you have influence over your followers. The third component is groups. You cannot be a leader of one of yourself. In order to be a leader, it has to occur within a group of people. And then fourth is a common goal. So leaders must work towards achieving something that the entire group wants to achieve. So it is working towards a common goal for all. So most importantly though, leadership does not require an authority, a title, or position. So you don't have to be a boss. You don't have to be listed in charge. You don't have to be called the manager, the CEO in order to be a leader. So as long as you have those four components of leadership, process, influence, groups, and common goals, you can be a leader anywhere within your group of friends, within your company, or within your life. So we know that leadership has evolved over the years, and there's a couple of different leadership theories that I'm just going to quickly touch on because you're going to have a whole class on leadership theories that's going to go into these in more in depth. But the first leadership theory came out in the early 1900s, and this was what we call the great man, or has now been changed to the great person theory. And this is the thought that leaders are born, not made. So it basically says that there are certain personality traits that contribute to successful leadership, and that if you were born with these traits, then that you would be a good leader. And so this was often thought about whenever we think about kings and queens, and that they were meant to be good leaders because of who their parents were, or because they were tall, or different things like that. Next, in the 1970s, we came about with situational leadership, and this focuses on leadership styles, and instructs leaders on how to behave according to their followers and the different situations. Moving on from there, we move to transformational leadership, and this focuses on developing followers for the good of the organization. So this is really where we get into that followers play a role in our leadership, in that we need to use, and that in transformational leadership, leaders use charisma and individual attention to influence their followers. So basically, as a transformational leader, you figure out where your followers are, what makes them tick, what their goals are, and you work on developing their personalities and helping them reach their goals. And then finally, we move into servant leadership, and this is where leaders prioritize others above themselves and their organizational goals. So leaders really focus on service and not outcomes. But what we do find is that when we focus on service and our followers, our outcomes actually become better. So servant leadership does have a lot of good in it, despite some of the criticisms that it might have. Leadership is about how to be, not how to do. So it is a really, when we talk about a process, it's a lifelong process of self-discovery and figuring out who you are. And so by developing your character, you become more versatile and you become a better leader. So some things you could need to ask yourself is, how can we be authentic if we don't know ourselves? So if you don't fully know who you are and what you want and what you're passionate about, how are you supposed to be truthful about those things with others? And then, what kind of person or leader do I want to be? And now, how do I want to get there? So if you really want to be a transformational leader, what does that mean for you and your personality and the things that you value? And what can you do to work on to get those values and those virtues in order to get you to that spot? So what we see here are the 7 leadership dimensions, and these are central to helping leaders manage through difficult situations. So some of these dimensions overlap. So what we can see is, as we demonstrate humility when we show compassion. And so you can see that these are developed from Aristotle's 12 virtues, which we touched briefly on earlier. Those are listed on the left. And then we see the additional dimensions of our leadership character framework on the right. And these are really important to help us in crisis situations. So for instance, judgment is extremely important, and it's very central to the framework because judgment is the leading cause of making bad decisions. So it's really important that we strengthen that dimension so that we can make good decisions in our leadership. Our leadership character is demonstrated, at least in part, by our communication. And with our communication, it affects how people view our company's products and the services, and that is our reputation. So personal reputation also affects the organization's reputation. So if there is somebody who's in charge of a company, so think of Jeff Bezos and Amazon. So if you feel like that he is doing a good job representing the company through his efforts with flying to space and the other things that he is doing, then you are more likely to have a positive um, view of Amazon, and you're more likely to keep using and buying from Amazon. If you have a negative um, view of Bezos and the things that he's doing and how he communicates in his press conferences and those types of things, then you are likely to have a negative view of Amazon and are less likely to actually use Amazon and purchase their products. So it's really important to have good communication. So our crisis communication theory states or rather instructs leaders to use different approaches for different situations. So not every crisis situation is to be handled the same way or to have the same canned speech or press release when it occurs. So the situational crisis communication theory highly recommends apologizing when the crisis is perceived as preventable, which means that the organization is likely responsible. So obviously, if you have to do a recall on a product that you sent out, then that would be a good time to apologize. Now, do we also need to apologize if there was a tornado that hit your building and caused a delay in sending out products? No, because those are two completely different situations and need to be communicated differently. But one of the things that's really important when you think about communication is being authentic. So obviously you want to put the best face forward for the organization that you can, but you want to also be really authentic about it because, like we talked about previously, people can see through deceit. And so if you are lying to protect yourself or protect the company, people are going to realize that. So that's why it's really important to understand the importance of an apology and the importance of taking responsibility and being authentic, which we'll talk about later on. So some statistics for you: 59% of people who took the Weber-Shandwick survey said that a company's leaders' communications are very or somewhat influential in their opinion of the company. And then 83% of CEOs believe that a strong CEO reputation can protect a business in crisis. So again, if we believe strongly in and support the CEO, then we are going to be more likely to support the company even if something bad happens. So crisis situations give companies an opportunity for a leader to show the best of themselves and their organization, and we do this through our communication. So here are some examples of why crisis management and that good communication is so critical. So after the United Airlines forcibly removed a customer that went viral on social media, their CEO put out this statement saying, "This is an upsetting event to us all here at United. I apologize to reaccommodate these customers." He also called the passenger disruptive and belligerent. So although he did apologize, he also pushed blame onto the customer and really used the terms like reaccommodate these customers. And again, just shifted blame and really didn't take responsibility. And so that did not fare well for United Airlines, as you probably know, that their reputation has decreased considerably over the last couple of years. There was the Equifax data breach where 143 million customers' information was breached. So they had poor communication because their first press release just really contained basic facts, and it really made almost no attempt to connect to the customers, to explain the situation, and so that also did not go over well. And then finally, we have Adidas' email that said, "Congrats, you survived the Boston Marathon," which at first glance may not seem like it was a miscommunication, but this was right after the bombing of the Boston Marathon. And so this was one of the first marathons that took place after that. So they turned around and came back and said, "We are incredibly sorry. Clearly, there was no thought given to the incentive email subject line we sent out on Tuesday. We deeply apologize for our mistake." So here you can see a better example of how they apologize and they take full responsibility for the fact that somebody did not put that thought in, proofread, or really deep dive into how this subject line could be taken. So like we briefly touched on earlier, judgment is very critical to good decision making. And there are elements of demonstrating judgment, and these are being situationally aware, cognitively complex, being decisive, being a critical thinker, being insightful, being pragmatic, and being adaptable. So these are all elements that go into having good judgment. But what we don't take into account a lot of times is our social norms and how powerful they can be and how much they can actually affect our judgment. So when we are surrounded by people who have bad judgment, we tend to start acting with bad judgment, even if we know what the right thing to do is. So it's really important to take the social norms and your surroundings into account whenever you are making decisions. So, although character is the foundation of effective decision making and obviously knowing right from wrong, but you have to have confidence in order to be able to make good decisions. So, even if you have character, you can't make good decisions without the right information. So, it's really important to get all of your facts together before you go into the decision making process. So, James Rest identified 4 psychological processes that people who behave morally will perform. The first one is know the possible causes of action, who it'll affect, and the impact on each of those people. The second one is determine which courses of action are morally correct. Then prioritize moral values over personal interests. So, although it may be personally best for the company to make money, if we need to prioritize what our moral value is over what's maybe best for the company or our actual personal interests. Have the strength and the skill to follow through. So this is really where our virtue of courage comes in, because sometimes we have to have the courage to follow through on a decision that might make some people angry or that might hurt the company, because it is the right thing to do. So we've seen a lot of times that bad decisions are made with really good intentions. So you might have the best intentions in the world, but that doesn't mean that you're going to make the best decision in the world. So an example of this is President Jackson, who he was responsible for removing the Indian tribes in the United States to the west of Mississippi. This was one of his reforms. So he argued that the United States policy of attempting to assimilate the tribes into society had failed and that the Native Americans' way of life would eventually be destroyed. So he said he recognized that whites desired the Native American lands, and he feared that if Native Americans remained in those areas, that they would eventually be exterminated. So he thought the best thing to do was to move them onto reservations. So he had good intentions of wanting to make sure that Native Americans got to hold on to their way of life and their traditions, but the way that he went about it was is clearly recognized now as the wrong decision. So, one of the good things that comes out of corporate failures is that it teaches us about our character and about ourselves. So, we can learn from other people's mistakes instead of having to make our own. So, what a great revelation that we don't have to make our own mistakes, that we can learn from examples, we can learn from research, we can learn from understanding our own strengths and weaknesses, and by practicing new behaviors. And all of that will help us build leadership character. Another part of our leadership character is understanding emotion and how to apply it to ourselves and others. And that is emotional intelligence. And that is really the key to strengthening leadership character. The quote at the bottom of the page is through self reflection and practice, we hone our ability and develop an approach for self development. So, this whole course is a practice in self reflection and practicing those. So, you'll see through your journals that I am having you practice that self reflection, and through things like your personal growth project, you are actually putting into practice some of the things that we will be talking about. So here are some leadership dimensions to learn from and strengthen, and these are things that we'll be talking about throughout the semester. So vulnerability, which is risking exposure, so exposing yourself. Authenticity, so living as your true self. Integrity, which is being very consistent and whole in the things that you say and the things that you do. Accountability, so this is responding to others and taking responsibility for the things that we do. Courage, so standing up for yourself and standing up for others. Humility, learning from others. No matter where you are in your life or your career, it is never too late to learn something, and we should always strive to learn more. And then finally, compassion, which is caring for others and ourselves. So we generally think about compassion for caring for others, but a lot of times we do not think about compassion for ourselves. And so that will be something that we will dive deeper into when we get into that chapter. So I want to leave you with a couple of things to think about for class discussions. So think of a time when you were expected to do something that conflicted with your values, and you spoke up or acted in ways to address the situation. So what inspired you to speak up against these things? And then what kind of impact did that have? Was it positive? Was it negative? Have you spoken up since then? And then think of another situation that maybe you did not speak up or act whenever you were expected to do something that conflicted with your values or ethics. So, what prevented you from speaking up? Was it fear of retaliation? Was it fear of what other people would think? And then looking back on that situation now in retrospect, what could you have done differently? That is all I have for you today. I hope you have a wonderful week.